So a little while ago, we took a look at an Intel ad campaign that pretty poorly tried to take on the M1 Max. And it looks like Microsoft is hopping aboard that train as well. They've had an ad spot that's been running called The Better Choice that compares the Surface Pro 7 and the M1 MacBook Pro, and we'll talk about that in a second. And then the new one that just came out today is basically the same thing. It's called Still the Better Choice, which compares the Surface Pro 7 to the iPad Pro. Today we're gonna take a look at these two Microsoft ads and talk about why they're just bad and why all of this, even just this style of advertising, is not a good idea. So before we get started, if you guys have seen any ads that you think poorly take on Apple Silicon or Apple in some way, similar to these Microsoft ads and the Intel ones that I made a video on before, definitely let me know. And if you want to see more videos like this, make sure to get subscribed. Okay, so we're gonna try to watch both ads with minimal commentary, and then we'll reflect on what made them so terrible. So let's start with the original ad from this campaign, which came out in January, called The Better Choice.
Today we have the Microsoft Surface Pro 7 and the MacBook Pro. The Surface comes with a pen and it is touchscreen. Mac gave me this little bar, but why can't they just give me a whole touchscreen? The Surface Pro has a detachable keyboard. Now with the Mac, you're kind of just stuck with what you got. But with the Surface, yes, you can run your favorite apps on it. It has the power to run all your apps. It is a much better gaming device. I love my games. Then there's the price. Yeah.
Oh dear. Yeah, every single part of that ad was either misleading, wrong, or just poorly thought out. I mean, just off the top of my head, gaming on a Surface Pro 7? Wow, I mean, there's a lot more that we have to unpack there, but that's your first taste. That was the first ad. Now let's go take a look at the new one that just came out literally today, April 5th, and it's taking on the iPad Pro. And I'll be watching that, ironically, on my iPad Pro.
A lot of people wanted me to compare the Microsoft Surface Pro 7 to the iPad Pro. So here we go. The Surface Pro has a built-in kickstand. Now with the iPad Pro, this is the Surface type cover. It clicks and attaches. I love that click. This is the iPad keyboard. It's a lot heavier. With the Surface, you have all kinds of ports. iPad has one. You want to be this guy? iPad Pro is just a tablet. Surface is a full computer and a tablet. And now, the price.
Right, so clearly there's a lot to talk about here. I think personally the first ad was worse. I think the second ad has some points where you're like, okay, I guess you could make a claim there. Like the kickstand thing, right? Sure, that would be nice if the iPad had a kickstand. It's not something that I care about personally, but that is a legitimate feature. That's something that the Surface has offered since the very beginning that you could argue is useful. However, all of the other comparisons that are made in both of these ads are subjective at best, wrong at worst, and pointless overall.
This is the Surface type cover. It clicks and attaches. I love that click.
Oh wow, it clicks? Well, I'm sold.
This is the iPad keyboard. It's a lot heavier.
Okay, so their point is that the Magic Keyboard is heavy and doesn't click. Right, so the problem with that, beyond the fact that it's subjective, you know, some people probably don't give a crap about how heavy their keyboard is, the main problem is that it comes across as such a minor thing that it appears as though Microsoft just couldn't think of anything else to compare.
With the Surface, you have all kinds of ports. iPad has one. You want to be this guy?
Okay, that's a fair argument. The iPad does only have one port, and I wish it would have more. Now, granted, Apple comes at this from a bit of a different angle. Their argument with the iPad Pro is that because you're like in the ecosystem and stuff, maybe you don't need the ports. You could also argue that Microsoft is ignoring the smart connector, but definitely the smart connector is not the same as like a USB port, so I'll give them that one.
iPad Pro is just a tablet. Surface is a full computer and a tablet. And now, the price.
So this is an interesting one because their argument here is basically the iPad is bad because it's not a real computer. And then they finish it off with that 1-2 punch of like, oh look, and it's more expensive. However, I would posit that is fundamentally flawed because first of all, it's subjective. You're saying iPad OS is less good than Windows 10. Well, that depends on what you want to do on it. And that brings me to the price, which is pretty problematic here because that configuration comes with a dual-core i3, 4 gigabytes of RAM, and 128 gigabytes of storage. So with that information, I think everything else about this ad completely falls apart. Can you really argue that it's a full computer that can do so much more than an iPad if it only has 4 gigs of RAM in 2021? And also, I do want to point out the storage because that's not exactly an equivalent thing, right? The iPad Pro comes as standard with 128 gigabytes, and so does the Surface Pro 7. But if you've ever used a Windows laptop, then you know that the way that those drives are formatted knocks off a couple of gigs, and Windows takes up a huge amount of space. So if I had to guess, you're probably only looking at 90, 85 gigs of actual usable drive space. Now granted, you could say that I'm taking a cheap shot and I'm arguing about something that doesn't matter, but this is the same commercial that said that you shouldn't buy an iPad Pro because the keyboard is too heavy. So I'm gonna take the shot. So armed with this new information about the rather dismal specification that Microsoft has chosen to compare to Apple's stuff here, let's go take a look at them comparing that 4 gigabyte of RAM dual-core i3 Surface Pro 7 to the M1 MacBook Pro. I'm sure it'll go fine.
The Surface comes with a pen and it is touchscreen. Mac gave me this little bar, but why can't they just give me a whole touchscreen?
They say that it comes with the pen, but the pen is sold separately. That's an obvious point that you gotta bring up. Don't say something comes with if you have to purchase that thing separately in order for it to come with it. I will say their argument about the lack of touchscreen could be valid. Again, I think it's very based on personal preference, but that's the whole point of advertising. You want to appeal to people's preference. And, you know, they take a shot at the touch bar, which again is fair, but not exactly new, and certainly not unique to the M1 MacBook Pro. They're basically falling into the same trap as Intel with this part.
The Surface Pro has a detachable keyboard. Now with the Mac, you're kind of just stuck with what you got.
So this to me doesn't even seem like a comparison. That's just stating a fact. They're basically just saying the tablet is a tablet and the laptop is a laptop. You guys take you all week to figure that one out? That's some impressive detective work there, Microsoft.
With the Surface, yes, you can run your favorite apps on it. It has the power to run all your apps.
Well, I'm gonna have to disagree with that one, Microsoft. Dual Core i3, 4 gigs of RAM, ringing a bell. That is a pretty terrible comparison to be making.
It is a much better gaming device. I love my games.
I love my games. I feel so bad for that poor actor when they're like, all right, now you're just gonna say, I love my games. You know, like a gamer would say. I mean, there's a ton of gamers that use the Surface Pro 7, as we know. It's a very popular gaming device. Even if you spec that thing to the moon, which by the way is only as far as a quad-core i7, so the most powerful Surface Pro 7 is not gonna come close to the M1 in terms of actual performance. Even if you put that in there, it's not a gaming computer. Are you serious? It's got integrated graphics, a quad-core CPU, like what?
Then there's the price. Yeah.
And really the price comparison is what seals the deal there, because they're trying to say, oh, look how much better it is, and it's cheaper too. But again, that configuration at $890 has a Core i3 and 4 gigs of RAM. I can't believe that that's a product that exists. If anything, the fact that they're making these comparisons to the MacBook Pro and the iPad Pro, basically they boil down to, hey, look at us, we're Microsoft and we're willing to neuter our product with a completely useless configuration just so we can undercut pricing. It's also worth noting that when they compare it to the M1 MacBook Pro, they conveniently don't talk about storage because their product has half as much, plus all that same like formatting and Windows taking up a lot of space. So that's not great. If you wanted to actually even remotely consider standardizing these things, then you'd have to pick the higher spec Surface Pro 7, which has the Core i5, 8 gigs of RAM, and 256 gigabytes of storage, and that's $1,200 before the keyboard. So it's basically the same price as an M1 MacBook Pro. And I'll tell you one thing, it's not as powerful. It's just not. Quad-core i5 is not gonna beat the M1. I mean, that's the problem with comparative advertising. you're, for one, giving a lot of screen time to your competitor here. There's a lot of screen time given to the iPad and the MacBook, which doesn't necessarily correlate with negative perceptions of those products. And because you can't go into any sort of detail on these things, then you're not really imparting any information. So the big takeaway for the consumer is just, wow, Microsoft really doesn't like Apple. Personally, I think comparison advertisements are a bit antiquated and a bit of a bad idea, especially for a large company like this. If you're a startup company, you're trying to shift the game, there's definitely a market for like Dollar Shave Club is a good example. They basically call out like the system of traditional razors and they say, here, this is a new way to do it. That's an interesting type of comparison advertising. This is a really stale, stagnant, not very effective version of it. For a company that's as large as Microsoft or Intel or Apple or Samsung or any of these big tech companies, it just comes across as stooping too low. What would probably be better is making an ad that shows what you can do with the Surface Pro 7. So not even just saying the Surface Pro 7 has a high resolution display, but saying with the Surface Pro 7, you can create things that you didn't think you could create before. So while not all comparative advertising is a mistake, these definitely are. I'm curious to know what you guys think of these two ads. Were there any decent points made? Do you think that these are effective at getting consumers to look at your product seriously, or are these mainly just to stir up controversy? Let me know in the comments below. As usual, don't forget to subscribe and consider following me on Twitter @LukeMiani. And with that, I will see you guys in the next video.